Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to ULT San Diego, here for the Aquarian series. This evening's presentation is about the astrological sign of Cancer, and that will be given to us by our own Jonathan Colbert. So before we get started, let me read to you the quote from Hermes regarding Cancer. Cancer is shown as devouring all that is transitory and represents the volatile element in alchemy. This is a quote from Shankaracharya. To him I make obeisance, who is the end of all wisdom, the goal of all attainment, the unseen lord of the flock, the supreme bliss, the good master. For living beings, human birth is hard to gain, then manhood, then holiness. Harder is perfection in the path of the law of wisdom. Hardest to gain is illumination, discernment between the divine self and that which is not the self, fully realized union with the eternal self, liberation. This is not to be attained without holiness, perfected through 100 myriad lives. These three things, hard to gain, come only through divine grace: manhood, desire for liberation, access to masters. Gaining at length human life, hard to win, and manhood, and an understanding of the revealed teachings. He who strives not for liberation in the divine self, deluded in heart, self-destroying, slays himself through grasping at the unreal. Who then is the very self of folly, but he who, deluded, follows selfish purposes after he has gained a human body and manhood hard to win? Even though they recite the scriptures and sacrifice to the gods and fulfill all works and worship the divinities, without awakening to the unity of the divine self, liberation is not attained even in 100 eons. For the scripture says that there is no hope of immortality through riches. Therefore, it is clear that ritual works are not the cause of liberation. Therefore, let the wise man strive hard for liberation, renouncing the lure of happiness in external things. Let him draw near to a master, good and great, fixing his whole soul on the purpose of the master's teaching. Let him, through the divine self, raise up that self of his which is sunk in the ocean of recurring life and death, firmly practicing uplifting through union with steadfast vision of the one, seeking freedom from bondage to the world through renunciation in all works. Let the wise strive who have learned the teaching, pressing toward the divine self. Works make for the cleansing of the heart, but not for the attaining of the real. The gaining of the real comes through discernment. Not even by myriads of works is it gained. Through discernment of the real, it is perceived that the imagined serpent is only a rope, and thus the painful fear of the great serpent, conjured up by illusion, is finally destroyed. The certain knowledge of the goal comes only through discernment awakened by right teaching, not through ablutions or gifts or myriad retentions of the breath. The gaining of the fruit is the reward only of him who possesses the qualifications. Circumstances, such as place and time, merely cooperate in the result. Therefore, let him who would know the real practice discernment, finding a master who is a river of compassion, an excellent knower of the eternal. He who is full of intelligence, illuminated, skilled in knowledge and wisdom, is fitted to teach the wisdom of the divine self, He wears the immemorial hallmark, and he is fitted to seek the eternal, who has discernment, freedom from self indulgence, quietude, and the other virtues, who ardently desires liberation. We give to you our own Jonathan Colbert.
Hello, friends. Thank you very much, Monica, for that very powerful reading from Shankaracharya. In that reading, he talks about how it's difficult to even be born. You can't take it for granted to even get a body. But a person has a body, can a person be for liberation? Does a person wish to join a path of renunciation? And finally, can a person um, find a real master, a real teacher? And none of these things are to be taken for granted. The theosophical masters who have stood behind the theosophical movement throughout the ages have indicated that the way to learn to seek the masters is to study their philosophy. And the way to serve the masters is to serve their humanity. And we hope that by delving into the zodiacal archetype of Cancer, as we have been doing every month, we can offer some kind of insights into um, being a real human being, understanding the idea of different levels of selfhood, and the idea of seeking liberation and of seeking masters of wisdom and their wisdom. So we see here in this slide here that this Hermes quote says, as was read so beautifully by Monica, Cancer is shown as devouring all that is transitory and represents the volatile element in alchemy. As we can see in watching the news and in watching YouTube channels and things like that, the world's on fire. All the existing institutions and assumptions um, are being devoured, really. And what will be left, we don't know. But it seems to be a time of precipitous change, and there is a volatility that is going on. But what we will try and seek to do is to understand the archetypes that are behind this at the philosophical levels. So, the kind of astrology that we would like to take a look at is philosophical astrology. And this has to do with it's not about personalities, am I a Cancer, am I a Leo, and all these things, because for several reasons, really. One reason is that a lot of us really aren't the sign that we think we are because of the precession of the equinoxes. Another reason is that we have all the signs in us, okay, in terms of the your moon sign, your Mercury, your ascending signs, you have this house and so forth. So we have really all of these archetypes within us. So, but so what we're going to try and talk about today is a philosophical level of astrology, which has to do with reasoning from universal principles to particulars, and then back again from particulars to universals. And these there are two different kinds of archetypes. We say that we're going to talk about archetypes rather than personality types, right? And there are the transcendent archetypes and what we could call immanent archetypes. Philosophical astrology seeks to combine the two, really. You have the transcendent archetypes, which are the timeless universals, which are Platonic ideas or forms. They're absolute essences which transcend the empirical world. Yet, paradoxically, they endow it with form and meaning. And transcendent archetypes are perceived through individual direct perception, pure buddhi in theosophical parlance. There are also immanent archetypes, which are more of the Aristotelian order. They are intrinsic within phenomenon. So, and they serve to transmute phenomenon from within. So they have this dynamic quality of potentiality to actuality to maturity. And these are perceived by means of empirical analysis. They are inductive. They're, at best, they are manas aspiring to buddhi manas. So this is the thinking capacity aspiring to the intuitive level. So this brings us to what is theosophical astrology. Much of this presentation will be based on one of the chapters in a book entitled Theosophical Astrology by Professor Helen Valborg, who was a theosophist, but who was also a professor of anthropology. And she reminds me of a professor that I had in college a lot of years ago, who had a PhD in psychology and in anthropology, and to the chagrin or delight of her students, she would talk in her psychology classes all about anthropology, and in her anthropology classes all about psychology. And the students that had more of an integrative kind of holistic mind really appreciated her. The ones that were just trying to figure out the boxes to check on the test, um, well, that's a different story. So, but the thing is about um, theosophical astrology is it's taking in an approach to these archetypes from a theosophical perspective, which is a perspective of unity, that all is one. It's a dynamic unity affirmed in the three propositions, and we'll get to those three propositions in a minute. A theosophical astrology would embrace the Hermetic axiom that as above, so it is below. As is the macrocosm, so is the microcosm. And we'll talk about that in a minute. And we'll also talk about what we're going to call three Aquarian keys, which are impersonality, incarnation, and procession. And we'll talk about those. So those are kind of cryptic and abstract, but we'll make our way through those. So with reference to this idea of a dynamic unity affirmed in the three propositions, I'll just outline what those three propositions are very briefly. The first proposition of the secret doctrine from H.P. Blavatsky is that there is a boundless, eternal, omnipresent principle which is beyond words and it's even beyond thought, and it contains, it sustains, and is everything. And another fundamental proposition is that the entire universe is one of law. It is that of unity expressed in circles, cycles, spirals, undulation and vibration, karma and reincarnation. And the third proposition is that everything is alive. And unity here is expressed as a universal pilgrimage of learning. All boils down to the idea that the purpose of life is to learn. So a theosophical astrology would include these three propositions, and they all affirm unity in different ways. Now, with this Hermetic axiom, as above, so below, it's saying that man is the microcosm of the macrocosm, and therefore you can use analogy and correspondence, and that these, in turn, are the keys to unlocking both the microcosm and the macrocosm. And this Hermetic axiom also includes the idea that everything that we see is an emanation from the invisible, it's supposed to say, that's a typo right there, to the visible. And it's from above to below and from within without. And finally, that the universe and man unfold through number and especially through ratio. And so some of the numbers that we will talk about today are basically 3 and 4. Today is all about 3 and 4. But 3 plus 4 is 7, which is the 7 principles of man and the 7 principles of the macrocosm. So that's the key to this idea of the Hermetic axiom, the 7. And the 12, which is 3 times 4. So you have 3 plus 4 and 3 times 4. That's the theosophical astrology, you could say. Now, we mentioned before what we're calling these Aquarian keys to theosophical astrology. It's based on the idea of acknowledging the idea of the precession of the equinoxes. So you have the Vedic system of astrology, which definitely acknowledges the precession of the equinoxes. And the Vedic system is based on archetypes and principles. You also have the tropical system, which is more of an empirical approach. So astrology being a science is both theoretical and empirical. The theoretical is the archetypes. What is the empirical? Well, the empirical is two facets. One is where are the stars, what's in conjunction with what, etc. But the empirical that I'm referring to here is the fact that throughout the ages, people have observed characteristics about that given age and have applied characteristics to it. So that even though the Vedic system and the tropical system are different, because the tropical system does not take into account the precession of the equinoxes, still people have applied characteristics to given signs that they've noticed about people and ages that are in that sign. So therefore, both systems have some validity. And I've heard one astrologer say that you can actually, just the way you can place laminates over each other, and then there is, or maps over one another, or screens over one another. You can look at both at the same time and see how they apply. So, interestingly enough, William Quan Judge, in an article, um, states that there are two keys that are unlocking these mysteries. One is the zodiac as an archetype, and the other is the Bhagavad Gita as duty. So we're going to try and talk about both these abstract archetypes, but also see how they can apply, hopefully, in everyday life in the form of duty, applications of archetype. Then finally, these Aquarian keys here, we want to talk about archetypes rather than personality types. So much of astrology and discussion about astrology is actually burdened by, what is my sign? What is your sign? And personality types, and getting kind of going down endless rabbit holes that have to do with the personality. Whereas really, this idea of looking at these archetypes and to think about how they really represent universal ideas, impersonal, eternal ideas and forms. And then if we can seek to how to put these ideals into practical application, then we are incarnating those ideals. We're making those ideals come alive in our life. And in that case, whatever kind of karma we encounter, we can turn it in to a field of dharma, into a field of duty, into a field of opportunity to help others and to learn how to help others. Now, here's a quote on the zodiac, and it's from Hermes, and it's actually from Dr. Helen Valborg, who writes that the zodiac symbolizes an entire cosmic cycle of evolution and dissolution. The zodiacal signs are ideographs and hieroglyphs with number, color, and tone. So speaking of numbers and speaking of 3 and 4, this is just going to be a beginning um, introduction to this idea of thinking numerically in reference to the 3 plus 4, making the 7 principles, and the 3 times 4, making the 12 signs of the zodiac. So we have 3 water signs. You have Pisces, Cancer, and Scorpio. So that's thinking in terms of threes. It's thinking in terms of elements, of the 4 elements. So you have the 3 water signs times the 3 kinds of signs times the 4 elements, and then you have the 12. So we'll be talking somewhat today about Cancer as a water sign and the meaning of that. And then you have the 4 cardinal signs, and there are 3 different modalities, and I don't know what the other 2 are. I forgot, but Cancer happens to be one of the 4 cardinal signs. In other words, these are signs that are initiatory, that they begin cycles, you could say. And for example, now these work really well with the tropical system because each one of these is the beginning of a season. Capricorn is the beginning of winter, Aries the beginning of spring, Cancer the beginning of summer, Libra the beginning of the fall season. But what we're going to look at is what we hope to look at as a more abstract, more higher level of what it might mean to be something, a cardinal sign. What does it mean to be an initiator, for example? What does it mean to be creative? What does it mean to have vision? And what does it mean to incarnate an ideal, for example? So this slide here, I've got I got to do something here for a second. You know how when you're doing a Zoom presentation, the things get in the way and you have to move them? That just happened. So Cancer is the crab, and it is the ruling planet is the moon. The ruling element is water. The modality in this case is cardinal. And the Nidana, all of these 12 signs correspond to one of the 12 Nidanas, is the personality, the Namarupa. And the abstract archetypes that Helen Valborg discusses in her article called Cancer are the archetypes of the reflective waters, the formative unfolding power, fullness and emptiness, personality as mask, and the celestial gate of men, and the voidness of the seeming full. Now, see if you can pick out some of these as we proceed. And during the Q&A, we can certainly come back to this slide to see what applications we can make. Now, another number that I'll talk about here is the number 2, just simply because it's a way of talking about the opposite signs. And if these archetypes are cryptic and abstract and difficult to discern, often what one can do is look at the opposite sign. Now, the opposite of Cancer is Capricorn. And it's these archetypes that I wish to point to. You see now the gate of the gods is in, let me go back out to the other modality here. So that way I can use my cursor. The gate of the gods is in Capricorn. And here in Cancer, we have the celestial gate of men. So we have gates in both cases. And what's the difference between the gate of men, the celestial gate of men, and the gate of the gods? Well, that's an interesting question. But these are ways of unlocking each other. Reflective waters in Cancer, and here you have mirroring and reflection in Capricorn. Very interesting. You have the hardening of Fohat in Capricorn, and you have the personality, and you have the idea of the mask, which is kind of like a hard exoskeleton, you could say. And the formative unfolding power in Cancer, here you have creative magic in Capricorn. So this is not me teaching or instructing. This is just me wondering. I'm just saying that's very interesting that these archetypes kind of mirror and reflect each other. There are people in this who are attending this meeting who probably could do a lot better job with how they unlock each other. But these are the questions to me are always more important than the answers anyway. So because it gets that kind of creative thinking going, that process going. And I think that there's more to be said about the unlocking of the archetypes than there is about, you know, the opposites in terms of Saturn compared to the moon and so forth. Because is the earth really the opposite of water? Things like that, you know. Now they are both cardinal modalities. That's interesting. And that's interesting here. You have the Namarupa, which is the personality, and the opposite over here is Bhava, that of becoming. The personality is that which goes through transition and it's being rebuilt and it's being transcended. What might that have to do with the idea of becoming? So these are questions that can be asked. Let me go back to the play, and I'll probably go in and out of play. One thing that I wanted to play with here, hopefully it's not too cryptic, is this idea of, actually, I'm going to go back into this modality again so I can use my little cursor here. Do you see how the crab here with its pinchers on both sides is a little bit like the San Francisco Bay? So you have, this is almost a Rorschach test. When you look at the San Francisco Bay, do you see water like the bay, or do you see land where people live, right? So it's the same thing here. When you see the pinchers here, do you see the outside, the exoskeleton of this crab, with his claws, or do you see the space in between? So here we're playing with the idea of fullness and emptiness. And you have the reflective waters also within the Bay of San Francisco. Unfortunately, I couldn't turn this Cancer symbol sideways to be like it is here, because this pincher here is like the peninsula where San Francisco is, sort of. And then up here in Marin County, that's like this pincher here. So, and the other thing about this is you have the Golden Gate Bridge. That gets you into the idea of the celestial gate of men. So this here is like the gate. And remember, in the last astrological sign that we discussed, Gemini, you had the idea of the doorway. Remember that? You had the two pillars, and they were the twins, and then you had the over beam going across the two, and that became like a door. Here you have the idea of the gate. And so we will be going into this idea of the gate, of the archetype of the gate, some. Not sure we'll be able to unlock it all. That's part of the adventure. I'm going to go back into play again. This is a quote from Professor Valborg talking about a lot of things, about um, bringing in Pythagoras, bringing in numbers, bringing in the exoskeleton of the shell, etc. It's hard material, namely it meaning cancer and it meaning the crab, which is a symbol for cancer. Its hard material shell is supported by 10 feet. As a decapod, it symbolically relates to the Pythagorean decad and suggests that the 4 points of Cancer at its base are metaphysically convertible into the 10 points of the cosmos. Though the carapace is empty, transitory matter, it contains the infinite germ of the eternal. So this is really playing with this idea of fullness and voidness together. And we'll see why that is important when it comes to understanding the import of the idea of the Namarupa. Here's another quote, and this is from Hierocles, that talks about the 10 and the 4, just like Professor Valborg did. Hierocles maintains that the power of 10 is 4. In other words, whatever you can find in the 10, you can find in the 4. For before we come to a complete and perfect decad, we discover all the virtue and all the perfection of the 10 in the 4. In assembling all the numbers from 1 to 4, in other words, counting 1, 2, 3, 4, the whole composition makes 10. 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 equals 10. 4 is an arithmetical middle between 1 and 7. That's interesting, right? That's the middle number between 1 and 7. And this number is 3. 4 being as many more than 1 as 7 is than 4. So that kind of explains Dr. Valborg's understanding of this idea about how the decapod relates to the Pythagorean decade, but it also ties in the idea of the 4 points of Cancer. Another paragraph from Professor Valborg. In the Chaldean and Platonic philosophy, Cancer is called the gate of men. Remember how we were playing with the idea of the San Francisco Bay and the Golden Gate Bridge, etc. As the 18th of the Hebrew paths of wisdom, called the house of inflowing, it was the gate through which souls descend. After passing through the pillars of Gemini, we talked about that. So there's this kind of evolution from Gemini into Cancer. You have the pillars of Gemini, you can pass through them, and then you're going through the gate now. And this is the idea of the souls are descending. It may have marked the polar entrance of the earth through which the souls poured in. And perhaps when at her northerly extreme, it will be the exit through which they leave. So that is very occult, very arcane. It has to do with the idea of how do the souls enter the earth in the first place, and how do they exit? So this is this idea of the gate of men. Nothing conclusive, everything is suggestive. Through the forces emanating from its gateway, the budding self-consciousness of androgynous Gemini becomes focused on the distinction between the objective and the subjective. So now we have this transition of the budding self-consciousness that we heard about last month through Gemini this becomes more clarified in terms of the distinction between the objective and the subjective. And this is very important in terms of understanding this idea of the fullness of the seeming void and the voidness of the seeming full, this idea of the gate, and the idea of understanding the Namarupa. Think about it, a gate for a minute. A gate is one of the nakshatras, one of the 27 nakshatras. That's one of the archetypes in that system. A gate, to me, to this student just thinking about this, does represent this transition from the subjective to the objective. Because in one world, in one area, you have a whole field of objectivity. But when you go through a gate into another world, what was object now becomes subjective. And so this idea of the gate is the beginning of making that distinction between the two. And it's a very important distinction because it's important to understand that in terms of just understanding life and having a perspective on how to proceed through life. Now, this idea of going from objectifying thought, okay, going from the realm of the subjective to the objective, we can see that it has a corresponding analogy in what goes on in neuroplasticity, where thought affects the matter of the brain. And it also affects it in terms of cycles, in terms of action and reaction, and in terms of setting up habits, and in terms of overcoming habits that one doesn't want to have anymore. So here's this kind of new realization and insight that neuroscience has brought to the fore and has become a very popular understanding. When neurons fire simultaneously, their synaptic connections become stronger, raising the chance that the firing of one will trigger the firing of the other. This property of neurons is summed up by the maxim, cells that fire together wire together. So that becomes setting up patterns. It's a little bit like that expression, sow a thought, reap a habit. Sow a habit, reap a character. I'm probably missing a few, but I think you know the idea of it. So this is also this idea of establishing cycles and having some kind of agency and control over the personality. That's very much facilitated by this expression here from William Quan Judge, one of the teachers of Theosophy, from an article that he wrote called Cyclic Impression and Return and Our Evolution, which he gave as an address at a conference. He says, in man, we have tides, which are called return of these impressions. That is to say, you do a thing once, there will be a tendency to repeat itself. You do it twice, and it doubles its influence, a greater tendency to do that same thing again, and so on. All through our character shows this constant return of cyclic impression. So this is beginning to make this transition here between the subjective and the object. What was subjective before, which was just our thoughts, becomes objective because we can watch patterns. We can observe how that our thinking and that our thoughts create neural lines of transmission in the brain, as well as waves and patterns within our psyche. And this is getting into the idea of Namarupa. And one approach to this idea of Namarupa, which is name and form, rupa always means form, is to think about HPB's definition of the word samskara in the Theosophical Glossary. She writes, it's literally from sam and kri, to improve, refine, impress. In Hindu philosophy, the term is used to denote the impressions left upon the mind by individual actions or external circumstances, and capable of being developed on any future favorable occasion, even in a future birth. The samskara denotes, therefore, the germs of propensities and impulses from previous births to be developed in this, or the coming janmas, or reincarnations. We're going to get into the samskaras a little bit more, but this is just by way of introduction to the idea of beginning to be able to make observations, impersonal observations regarding our fields of growth. So as we said, Namarupa has to do with name and form, and it also has to do with the idea of the mask. This idea of the mask here in this slide is just depicting the idea that a person may wish to don a mask, and we all don masks. And this is a very Jungian idea, that you have the mask, which is the persona, and the shadow, which is everything but the mask, according to Jung. But here, this woman is choosing. It looks to me like that's what this slide is depicting, is that she's choosing between masks. So she has agency regarding the masks. She's not identifying with the persona. And after all, persona means mask. Mask means persona. And so she has some choice. Well, which mask am I going to wear? You know, how are we going to present things? To just try to talk about the importance of the personality. And in Theosophy, we talk about transcending the personality, and that's the heart of Theosophy, really. But the way that you transcend something that is part of life is to establish agency and to use the higher self to refine the lower self. The higher self raises up the lower self. And the other thing is that the higher ego within each of us, because we are all gods, that are these reincarnating gods that are on the path of learning, in order to make an impact and an impress in the world, to really act in the world but not of it, the higher ego needs the assistance of its alter ego, the personal self. The higher ego, writes HPB in Psychic and Noetic Action, that's part of the essence of universal mind. So that's just how high our consciousness is in our reincarnating selves. We're actually part of the essence of universal mind. So given that that's the case, that higher ego is unconditionally omniscient on its own plane. And it's only potentially so in our terrestrial sphere. It can't really act in our terrestrial sphere by itself. It has to act solely through its alter ego, the personal self. So that's how important the personality becomes. Philosophically, it's something to be seen through, and to be seen that there's an emptiness in the seeming plenty. But psychologically, and from the perspective of incarnating these ideals into everyday life and making Theosophy a living reality in our lives, the higher ego has to function and act through the personal self. So it behooves us to understand something of the personal self. In this slide, you have the sage here who is instructing Rama. I think it's Vashishta who's instructing Rama in the Ramayana. So Vashishta is like the higher ego, and Rama in this case is like the personality. and see the posture that the personality has to be in, that of total reverence and adoration and attunement to the teacher. And that goes very far to help us understand the posture of the personality, the mental posture, if you will, of the personality in relation to the higher self within. Now, let's talk a little bit about the five skandhas. Is there a bar, by the way, that's kind of interrupting the title to the slide? If not, then I won't worry about it. It's not a problem. Okay, Ken, thank you.
No, it's clear.
So the rupa, you have these five skandhas, and these are five tendencies that constitute the nama rupa, which is name and form. And the first of which is the rupa, which is the physical body, and it's symbolized by a ship containing four passengers. And any ship or any form, any rupa, is composed of cohesion, undulation, radiation, vibration. Now, I'll explain this wild slide here. This is four passengers in one of Elon's space experiments. And so he's created a anti-gravity chamber and letting these astronauts, potential astronauts, know what it's going to be like to not have gravity. So I use this as the illustration of the physical body, which would be that whole chamber that they're in, with these four passengers, which are these four astronauts. And so the four remaining skandhas are Vedana, Samjna, Samskara, and Vijnana. So the most physical of them all is the sensations that we all experience, bodily and mental. And then comes Samjna, perceptions of phenomenon through the lens of sense organs and brain. None of these are good or bad. These are just what we have to work with. These are our vestures. The next is samskara, mental formations in an active sense. The 51 mental phenomenon, we'll get into that in a minute. And Vijnana, volition through awareness of Vedana, Samna, and Samskaras. So I'm going to say that this girl is this last one. Because why? Because that's Vijnana. What is volition? It's through awareness of the other three. So see how Vijnana is awareness of samskara, sajna, and Vedana. So the reason I'm saying that she's that is because she's higher than the rest and she has perspective, you could say. So anyway, just the idea that there are these four skandhas within Rupa, and that is the five skandhas, and they're all aggregates, and they are tendencies. Aggregates meaning that they are heterogeneous. They are not absolutely real within themselves. They are to be seen through, and the degree to which we can see through them is the degree to which probably this Vijnana one would apply. Then there's volition that can take place through the awareness of seeing through the others and seeing them all in perspective. So we mentioned in this last slide that there were 51 mental phenomenon. That we got from Helen Valborg's article on cancer. And she actually refers to these phenomenon here, and I looked them up as to what she might be referring to. And I think she's referring to the Abhidharma from Asanga, because as you'll see that there's going to be 50 or 51 aspects of the personality. Now, the context of the Abhidharma is that the personality has to be analyzed and seen through from the perspective of a disciple. So this isn't necessarily just a psychological inventory. This is an inventory of the persona in relation to a student on the path. So the five omnipresent factors here are feeling, discernment and discrimination, intention, attention, and contact. The five factors with a determinate object, which would be like a goal, would be aspiration, resolution, appreciation, mindfulness, concentration, wisdom, intelligence. There's 11 virtuous mental factors of faith, shame, embarrassment. These are virtuous, by the way. So there's some sense that a person could argue this, but there's always room for a person who's trying to be on the path to perfection, where these would have their place. Faith, shame, embarrassment, non-attachment, non-hatred, non-delusion, diligence, pliancy, heedfulness, equanimity, non-violence. And then there's 6 root mental afflictions, which are attachment, anger, pride, ignorance, afflictive doubt, afflictive views. And then there's 5 of those. There's 4 variable mental factors, which are sleep, regret, inquiry, analysis. And then this last slide has these 20 secondary mental afflictions. I'll just let you kind of park on these. But these are things to kind of transcend and to, in terms of meditation and self-study, to realize some objectivity about. Suffice it to say that what we've been trying to talk about in relation to Nama Rupa and of all these characteristics is to being able to see through the Nama Rupa, to see through the personality, to no longer, in that case, the field becomes objective. And in an objective field, you no longer need to identify with it. No longer need to say, I am this, I am that. In one's meditations and observations and self-study, one can say, oh, this occurred today, or oh, this is occurring right now. And to ask questions and begin to transcend and to see through. Here's a line from Professor Valborg. She's talking about this idea of the crab. Now, these next slides that I'm going to read are very cryptic, they're very arcane, they're very esoteric, and they require a lot of quiet meditation. But here, she's talking about Cancer the crab as a, let me try, I got to do something here. These bars are pretty intrusive. Let's try this again. Okay. Oh, now the bar is still in the way. Try something else. Representing the relatively dark constellation of Cancer, the crab is a shrouded unknown entity which seizes or swallows, but also guards the light that lies concealed behind it, is the emblem of the mysteries. So now we have this idea of the crab being something so sacred, so exalted, so sublime, that it just transcends any idea of what we thought of when we normally think of the idea of a crab. So you have this crab nebula, you could say. Now, within the constellation of Cancer, you have this, what they call the beehive star cluster. And that's why we use that image right there in the upper right. I don't know how strong you can see it in your computer. But these star clusters, I looked it up on Wikipedia. they're so mysterious. There's thousands of them that they found, and they are clusters of 1,000 or more stars that are created or um, emanated or given birth at the same time from a unified nebula field. So this is the Beehive cluster within the constellation of Cancer. So anyway, what Helen Valborg writes is the constellation of Cancer is not boldly apparent to the physical eye. And like the Great Lodge, now she's talking about the Great Lodge of Mahatmas. Like the Great Lodge, it is a nebula-like zone of profoundly occult influence. Its stars sharpening and individuating only to the gaze of one who has knowledge of the precise inner instruments which can reveal their nature. Now, we all think of H.P. Blavatsky as a Leo, right? And this analysis here of that there's in some ways, if you look at the Vedic system, she was really a Cancer. It kind of explains some of this extremely esoteric and arcane and sublime methodology that we've employed here and that Valborg employs in terms of talking about how subtle and how abstractly um, esoteric the constellation of Cancer really is. She writes, many who associated H.P. Blavatsky with the zodiacal sign of Leo thought of her in terms of a powerful imposition of will upon a situation through the sheer force of character. Cancer, exoterically associated with the incarnation of popular will, seems to belie the nature of her work. It's like HPV wouldn't have anything to do with popular will, we say. But if one considers the deeper esoteric role that Cancer plays in relation to the moon, it becomes apparent that the entire process whereby the Great Lodge took on the sheaths of earthly existence, enabling it to introduce a critical spiritual impulse in the dark age of Kali Yuga, may be subtly grasped in terms of the symbol of the craft. And hasn't one ever wondered that? How could they introduce such a sublime system, such an amazing philosophy right here in the age of Kali Yuga? How do they even pull that off? This might give some kind of a insight as to that. It has to do with reflecting. And the light of the moon isn't always lunar, so to speak. It's reflecting the light of the sun, of the solar impulse in some contexts. Writes Professor Valborg, the astral essence given forth to the world by H.P. Blavatsky was given freely, not so that men could partake of more names and forms, but so that they could gain access to the solar impress, which the substance of her consciousness so generously conveyed. Like the Queen Moon, she faithfully reflected the light of the great Dion Chouhans. And her entrance into the world was made through the gate of the human soul, the northern gate of the sun. She came as an emissary of the oldest constellation, which witnessed the first acts of creation and which remains in the heavens as the silent watcher over the earth, observing the development of whole races of beings upon its shifting continents, hastening where karma permits the divine process of spiritual evolution. Continuing, like great teachers who mirror her, she introduces the impress, which provides the vehicle of spiritual growth and simultaneously ensures the death of all that is devoid of the living germ of spirit. For this reason, the presence of such emissaries in the world is like a death knell to effete institutions and causes. Their teachings only mirror that which points beyond form, and they immediately reveal the lifeless character of mummified religious and social structures. A great lesson to be learned through the force of cancer in the world is extended through Namarupa, name and form, and serves to teach that the mask is false, the form is hollow, the show unreal. Oh, Monica, would you mind reading this from Percy Bysshe Shelley? Oh, you'll have to unmute yourself, I think.
Apologies. The loathsome mask has fallen. The man remains scepterless, free, uncircumscribed, but man equal, unclassed, tribeless, and nationless, exempt from awe, worship, degree, the king over himself. Just, gentle, wise, but man passionless? No, yet free from guilt or pain, which were for his will made or suffered them. Not yet exempt, though ruling them like slaves, from chance and death and mutability, the clogs of that which else might oversoar, the loftiest star of unascended heaven, pinnacled dim in the intense innate.
Let's see. Okay. I'm going to go out here because I just want to admit two people here real quick here. There we go. One person at least. That's the presentation for today, and we have a few minutes for questions and answers or observations. And Monica, you can call on people as you see fit.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Jonathan. This was absolutely wonderfully comprehensive. So much information, I couldn't keep up with the impulse to question. But let's start off with Brina, who has a question. You have to unmute, Brina.
Yeah, unmute Brina.
I thought it was very scholarly. Yeah, you drew in, Jonathan, many aspects of later philosophers that talked about the dialectic and so on, utilitarianism and deontology. All was taught by the Vedas. All, as you say, amazing. The Vedas, they had no instruments. It was just in their minds how they came to understand these things. I'm always amazed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to Theosophy. It is interesting what you say about how so much of this is anticipated by the Vedas, because one of the things that Theosophy does is it brings it marries and puts together the East and the West, while at the same time showing that it really all came from the East. And HPB is so genius at pulling together these different modalities taught through Western philosophy. But at the same time, there's this Eastern undercurrent that's kind of like a river that flows through it all. It's just quite magnificent.
Yes.
And I also wish to thank Professor Valborg in the way that she keeps the tonality of these symbol particles that she brought. It's such an exalted, it's academic. She was a PhD anthropology teacher and so forth. but the way she pulls it together, this integrative kind of a mind, uh, and ties it together with these important points in the secret doctrine and with the hero's journey, you know, and with mythology. And this a whole idea, like from Joseph Campbell, that the dream is really the individualized myth, and myth is really the collective dream. So all this magnificent storytelling really ties together with this kind of an approach.
I thank you, Jonathan. I'm noticing that all of us are basically muted. So, okay, great. Thank you. Judy Salzman. There.
Hello, I hear water running somewhere, which is an indication, I guess, that Cancer is a water sign.
That's totally it, Judy.
Yes, but my question has to do with in so-called Western astrology, the precession of the equinoxes is not accounted for, but really the birth sign is the center, the position of the sun in that particular sign. And so really the precession of the equinoxes has to do with the angle by which we look at the sign. And I may be wrong about this, so I would like to be corrected if I am. But it would appear that the importance of astrology, as you pointed out, isn't so much the study of personalities as is popular in the newspaper, but really the whole cycle of humanity. We need to look at that. The entrance of the sun into various constellations is what is preempting the seasons. And we need to look at the cycle of humanity and the evolution of humanity in terms of the entrance of the sun into these constellations into higher and higher cycles. Would this be true of astrology, which you pointed out basically comes from the East? And the Veda is so old, I understand, that it even refers to Vega as the pole star at one point, which would be 12,000 years ago. Anyway, could you comment on that?
Other than to say that that was a really good summary and very helpful. I'm not as technically versed in that. What you just now said about Vega and so forth, that's one of because the whole system, as I understand it, has to do with the orientation of the Earth. And if you extended the axis of the Earth straight from the South Pole through the North Pole and on into infinity, past the North Pole, you could say that the axis of the Earth wobbles like a top wobbling, and that wobble is in a precession, and it draws a circle, you could say, through the heavens. So therefore, that axis is pointing at different North Stars every 2160 years. So in every sidereal cycle, you have, and there's 12 of them, and they trace out a cycle of almost 26,000 years. So 1/12 of that, my understanding, is like 2,160 years. So the age of Aquarius is this, they're all pretty much the same cycles, my understanding is. So during different astrological cycles, you have different pole stars. So the North Pole, the North Star that we say is the North Star right now, hasn't always been the North Star, and it's a different points to a different North Star in every cycle. So the whole thing is about the theosophical approach to all this is the idea of cycles, and everything is relative to context. So even the cycles of time are relative to the context of that time period. So context is so much an important part of understanding anything in a theosophical understanding of things. So there's so much more to be said, but I really appreciate your remarks.
Thank you.
Jonathan, when we think about the fact that the Vedas were written between 1500 and 500 BCE, we are just amazed at the way these scholars thought about the world, ego, and things like that, that much later Freud and Jung came up with. But these were Aristotle and so on. But these were the basic things way back, way back. There's an inspirational. It was amazing. The Vedas are really amazing documents of our humanity.
Yeah, it makes you, to me, this thing about the depth and the breadth of what humanity even is, it's such a total inspiration towards solidarity. The solidarity that we have with all other people that are alive today and who have ever been alive and who will be alive. And because of this archetypal understanding and this whole through line through all of myth and dream, and this understanding of fables and of cosmogonies and of ideas about how the universe came into existence, and all of the drama, the Greek gods, but also of the Hindu gods, of all the other gods that have to do with the human plight and situation.
Yes. Wonderful. I have a few questions, one of which, Jonathan, is you spoke early on about how the signs, the opposites, unlock one another. What do you mean by unlock one another?
Monica, either you, my internet connection's unstable. That's a bummer. Could you restate your question? I'm sorry.
Absolutely. I was saying early on in the presentation, you spoke about how the opposite sign unlocks the other. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit about what that means. How is it that the opposite sign unlocks the other?
There are people who are attending this meeting that can understand it better than I do.
Okay.
I kind of exhausted my understanding of it when I gave when I presented on that idea.
Mm-hmm.
I was just trying to say, now, I'm the one who gave the presentation on Capricorn. So if I would have retained everything I talked about, that would be a big help. I do remember that in this case, you have Capricorn is the opposite of Cancer on the other side. And that's true. And Rena mentioned the dialectic.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of true. And that's why the dialectic is so important. You know how when somebody's trying to explain something, they explain what it's not, and then they go to what it is. There's a certain question and answer natural dialectic built within our very souls, it seems. And so, but in this case, one thing that occurs to me is that I do remember that Capricorn had to do with creative magic. And to me, that's interesting because in 2000 years, we'll be entering the age of Capricorn. So right now we're in the age of Aquarius, right? And a lot of times we make this big deal. We're in the age of Aquarius. Well, Theosophy says that humanity's been on this planet for 18 million years, which means that we've been in the age of Aquarius at least 700 times in this cycle alone, and we'll be in the age of Capricorn, the same amount of things. So it's this incredible cycle and this incredible dialogue of the ages, actually. But And this idea of creative magic in the age of Capricorn, why would that have to do with the following of the age of Aquarius? Isn't the age of Aquarius when we can begin to learn to think, and that spirituality is really decentralized, and that we all have this godlike capacity of thinking within ourselves? And wouldn't we need to master that idea before we're going to enter the whole age of creative magic? If that's true about the age of Capricorn, can you imagine all of these magic powers that are going to start unfolding in millions of people? That sounds like a dicey time, but it also sounds like an incredible time of opportunity and brilliance and creativity and so forth. So, but to understand the voidness of the seeming full, which is one of the archetypes of Cancer here, wouldn't that be one of the very first steps towards creative magic? Any kind of creativity means that a person has to get away from fixation, where one is hypnotized by external objects, by external things that people say, and to be able to and not be hypnotized by one's own persona. And that's kind of the ability to objectivize the persona. And one of the great clues that a person is getting some kind of objectivity in relation to the mask, in relation to oneself, is that they don't take themselves all that seriously. You know, we learn to laugh at ourselves. So in some ways, we take ourselves even more seriously because we know that there's this great task that the human ego has, you know, in each life. But in other ways, when we take ourselves less seriously. But there might be somebody who could explain this at a more theoretical level.
Um,
What do you think, Monica? Just looking at the
well,
slide.
it may be this is related to another question I had, and that is regarding the skandhas. Is a student to think that the skandhas, the root or how the skandhas come to be are the result of repetition? And if that's so, then it definitely would tie into the cycle of evolution and dissolution. And gathering these couple of thoughts together, does this mean that entering into an astrological sign is an opportunity to not just transcend personality, but also to disempower, let's say, skandhas that may or may not have been, through this repetition, a difficulty in breaking loose from and blocking one's conscious connection and awareness of that to the self of all. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's very beautiful. It kind of invites, when you said the self of all, it kind of reminded me of that expression in the voice of the silence, knowest thou of self the powers, O thou perceiver of external shadows. By focusing on the universal truth of all, that puts all these shadows into perspective. But there are other raised hands, and especially if anybody who has a raised hand in reference to Monica's question, because we are kind of running short on time.
I'm sorry.
No, I've been given too long of answers. That's the problem.
No, I apologize. Maybe we should let David answer. I know that we just heard from Brina.
Hi,
David.
Well, thanks, Jonathan, for your presentation. It's quite broad, but it covered a lot. A simplistic answer to what you were talking about, Monica, is, you know, the opposite signs, they're polar opposites. So you might say they balance out each other. So the two together kind of make a whole. So if we're having problems, in one, if we look to the polar opposite, there may be qualities there we can find we'll find the answers to help us with what's going on that opposite sign, or even in those skandhas, maybe as you're referring to it as. But I want to talk about actually something else. One, I always love that comment. I don't know where it is in the SD. It's kind of a simple aphorism, but HPB says astrology is to astronomy what psychology is to physiology. So it points at that it's really the science of the inside, of the self.
Wonderful.
Like psychology. Also, you were kind of making a proposition that maybe HPB was more of a Cancer than a Leo in some ways in your talk. It's interesting in the regular study of people's charts, besides all the planets and where they're located in the chart, a very important keynote is what's called the ascendant. That is which constellation is rising. It's on the ascendant at the birth time. And from what I've seen, where there's been agreement on HPB's birth time and her chart, she has Cancer rising. So I just thought I'd throw that out as kind of an interesting observation.
Very much so. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Yeah.
Des.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Jonathan. This is really, really a beautiful presentation. I know that when you brought up that, I guess it was a satellite photo of the San Francisco Bay, I got to thinking about the land and how the land and the glyph that we have of the crab, and several words I wrote down. And one was exoskeleton, the other was memory, moon, skandhas, and lunar petries. I wonder if there is a connection between all those, given that the moon is the planet for this sign, and that the crab has an exoskeleton, which almost can be related to as that mask, but also in what relation does its relationship to the moon, is there any connection between that and the lunar petries and memory? Thank you.
Yeah, I think so. I think the next person who has their hand up, Michelle, might be able to answer the question more succinctly than I. Michelle, do you wish to take a crack at that question? And any other ones?
About the Cancer being associated with the lunar petries?
Yeah.
Yes, it very much is. And especially when we're looking at the dynamic of Cancer in relation to Capricorn, even though Capricorn is ruled by Saturn, it kind of stands as the sun, in a sense, to the moon. And it's an interesting statement, I believe, in Helen's article, where she says that Cancer is the oldest sign. And I think this is kind of getting into deep waters here. But I think that because Cancer is associated with the lunar petries, especially when we're looking at the zodiacal signs in terms of involution and evolution, then Cancer would be associated, as part of the involutionary descending phase in that process. And so I think there's a lot of mystery there. especially in regard to what HPB says in The Secret Doctrine, but short answer is yes.
Thank you, Michelle. And were you going to come in on anything else in relation to this question about
Yeah.
the sign?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to say that although HPB did have her son in Cancer, and it's not completely, we don't really know what her ascendant sign was. There's a lot of speculation there. But interestingly, if you're going off the Vedic system, she does have Mars, Saturn, and Mercury in Leo, and a strong conjunction of Mars and Saturn in Leo, as well as, the communication, the very strong communication that she was known to have, are kind of symbolized by those 3 planets.
Very helpful. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Truth?
Yeah, good.
Unmute.
Yes, I had a short slideshow that if after this meeting, if anyone would like to see, I could share that with you about Ephesus and the relationship between Artemis and Cancer.
Okay. Why don't we can do that after the meeting's over, and then anybody who wants to stay for that, then we can do it, because I know you and I have been talking about it. So.
Okay, thank you.
Brina, did you have another question?
I have a very quick thing, and this slide sort of encompasses the universe in many ways. Monica's question was opposite signs. How do they unlock each other? Well, if you look at it, if we had time enough to reflect on the left and the right of these, we can bring them together. As often happens, when we look at things that are opposite and we think deeply on them, we realize they're one. But it takes a long time. It's just like the dialectic, or it's like, two lawyers. One is the thesis, the antithesis, and so on before the judge. And ultimately, somebody makes a decision. So opposite signs are not so opposite. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you. It brings to mind that kind of popular idea of a certain sign being the catalyst for another sign. I think that
Yes.
that might be somehow related.
Yes.
Let's see. Let's look in the chat if you don't mind. My name is Erica, and I'm from San Diego. Welcome, Erica. Ann Butters, to everyone. Hello, I'm Ann from Southeastern Florida, active member in the Deerfield Beach branch. So welcome, Ann. Let's see. Hi, Ann from Truth. Jim and Michelle, to everyone. Mutable, fixed, and cardinal signs.
Thank you, Michelle.
Yes, thanks, Michelle. From Nathan to everyone, thank you for such an insightful presentation. Just what was needed and much food for spiritual nourishment. Thank you. Des.
Go ahead.
Des, excellent, Jonathan, comprehensive, insightful, and wonderfully presented. Says here, 3 new messages. Oh my goodness. Forgive me. Very interesting, remarkable presentation. Miluka, thank you, Jonathan. Very interesting subject and its connections. Your talk reminds me of the following quote from Lucifer. Signs and symbols are proved to be the natural expressions of ideas in accordance with fixed laws, and the method is applied by way of illustration to the interpretation of the emerald tablet of Hermes Trismegistus. The relation between number and form is shown as exhibited in geometrical, forgive me. It just won't stay still.
Figures.
Thank you, Maluka. Please tell us the rest.
in geometrical figures, and M. Papus give us a clue to a subject we have puzzled. Something is blocking in here. We have puzzled many. The actual influence in life of name. This chapter is most thrilling, but lack of space forbids any detailed comments. So for so much, we have to be said.
Ah, beautiful.
Lucifer.
Thank you. One more from Victor Williams to everyone. Good evening. Great presentation. I am an associate, Victor Williams, PhD in Florida. So great to have you, Victor. Please come back and be with us. And I think that's it for our chat.
You want to tell us about next week?
Okay, so next week, the presentation is entitled The Eye. From Hermes, the eye of the wise man is directed by him at will, and when at rest, is focused on infinity. It will be given to us by our own Truth Colin, and we hope you come back and be with us.
So the meeting is over, but anybody who wants to stick around and hear Truth, he has a short follow through that you can go ahead and do it, Truth. You can do. Are you? Yeah, you're a co-host. You can share your screen.
Oh my goodness. Grandpa. My grandfather's name, Ephesians.
Really?
Oh, I'm sorry, I was muted. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Yep.
Yep, I see it fine.
Okay, so
Priest
I'm just
Lady
gonna.
of Ephesus.
So, for anyone interested, the oldest title that I found is for the Light Bearer, which was Blavatsky's magazine, was called Lucifer, and that means the Light Bearer. And so the oldest title of the Light Bearer is Artemis of Ephesus, also known as the Cretan Lady of Ephesus, as far as I know. And so she was the one associated with the astrological sign of Cancer. So I'm just going to go through this. Let me go to full screen.
Hey, right there.
Okay, yeah, I just got this Mac. So here's the without. You can see this is, if you're looking up at the night sky and you had really good vision, you would see that. And here, connect the dots. And it's in between Leo and Gemini. And what I wanted to point out is in the center of Cancer is this beehive cluster. I'm not sure if it's called a nebula, but there are over 1,000 stars in it. And there's another illustration. And here's a close-up of the Beehive Nebula, which I think you saw in Jonathan's slide. And here's a better close-up that shows you how many stars are in it. Here's how the ecliptic goes through the signs. Here's, without anyone to tell you, it's a crab, but like you use your imagination. How do you decide that it's a crab? Like, where do you put the crab? Where are the claws and whatnot? But, you find various illustrations. And here are some images of the goddess of Ephesus and Artemis. And then she has other names also. But there are various animals on here, and I'm just going to skip past this because we don't have much time. But for a long time, people thought these were breasts hanging off of Artemis, but they're actually more likely bull's testicles because of the association with fertility. And on her arms, you see she has lions, and she was known to ride on a lion. So the ladies of the temple may have actually ridden on lions or walked around with them. Here are some other images, and you can see that the coin of Ephesus was this bee coin. And as you can see the lines on down there. Here are some other images of the statuary that's been found, some from funerary. And I wanted to point out that on her head, she has a castle or a tower. And that to me is very interesting because it reminds me of the kingdom of heaven. Here's another image of her with a tower on her head. And in this, you can see close up, you have various scenes. Here's the star crab. And I couldn't get a clear picture where it showed, but they kept saying that the crab was on her chest plate. So if you can see in the center here, there's the crab, and then there's the other elements around it. I'm not sure what those are. There's a close-up. You can see the crab on her chest plate. And here's another, I couldn't get a clear picture of this either, but you can see that these are various astrological signs next to the crab. And the crab is the center of the chest plate again. And I imagine it was protective. Here's another image, a statuary. And you can see next to her head, there's a griffin. There's, I think, a eagle, or no, there's the griffin, the lion, and I forgot the other one. But, and in this, we can see there's various bee associations with Ephesus. And here is the stars again, and I showed that it's also the shape of a hand, and so you can see like a hand is also like a claw, and it has to me to do with the theme of grasping, because you have the claws of the crab, and also your hand is a bit like a claw, and it reminded me of the Buddhist emphasis on tanha or thirst or grasping. So that's all I wanted to show you. Just the interesting relationship to me between the bee and the beehive cluster right here. You're muted, Jonathan.
Hey, Truth, I just wanted to ask you a question. This thing about the Beehive Nebula, when I looked up these beehive clusters in Wikipedia, it talked about how the clusters, it could be like 1,000 or even 10,000 stars. But the thinking is that they all came from the same nebula, and that like a nebula field. So apparently there's a different way of looking at a nebula. Instead of just a future star, you can have a whole magnetic field of thousands of stars, and all of these thousands of stars within a cluster come from one nebula. So that's what made me think about this Beehive Nebula thing being a field of stars. And that was so incredible. The Pleiades is another such star cluster, and that's very mysterious. And that's supposedly connected with the very center of our galaxy, the Pleiades. So these are very mysterious subjects. Not that I know anything about them, but I'm just saying it's a mystery.
I agree. And what was interesting to me was the relationship between the beehive and the domain of the goddess. Artemis was associated also with Isis and a few other goddesses of similar, like different cultures. And just that it seemed like the temples dealt with all things feminine. And so childbirth would be one of those things. And it's just interesting to me that, with their vision and their ability to see back then, if you assume they didn't have telescopes, like it's interesting that it's this beehive cluster, and there's all kinds of bee motifs around Ephesus, and it is also associated with childbirth.
The other thing about a beehive is that it's seemingly parts, lots of different bees, right? But it's all one field.
Truth. That was very interesting. I like that very much. I was thinking that when you were putting one of the image, and Jonathan also did, that Cancer have a 69 as a symbol. It have the yin yang in it. And it's one of the few signs that can walk forward and backwards too.
That's great.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Most of you know more than me about astrology, so I'm looking forward to your comments.
Beautiful.
But
Okay.
yeah, it took you well over. Thank you for
Well,
watching.
thanks for putting that together, and we're looking forward to your. I assume this is practice for your presentation on the eye next week, Truth?
Yes.
Good practice, Truth.
Well, I've worked with lighting well over 20 years, and so
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
We
spend
thought of
some time
Truth.
thinking about the eye. So
Yeah, because that's that would be very fitting because he works with lighting for the interesting thing about what Truth does with lighting is he creates moods in, let's say, a concert with light.
Wow.
And he pays attention to what's going on and he shifts the light as per the story that's being told through the music. Is that an accurate thing to say, Truth?
yeah, I work as an LD, and I just sort of try to match the lighting to the music. Yeah, that was a great presentation, Jonathan.
It was wonderful, Jonathan.
Yeah.
Thank
Jonathan.
Yes, very comprehensive. Thanks.
Thank you guys for being here. Okay.
Thought-provoking.
Thank you for
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Jonathan.
for
Jonathan.
continuing to inspiring us too, Jonathan.
you. Yes.
Catch y'all on the flip side.
Yep. Thank
Okay.
you,
Comment to
Everyone
Truth.
take care.
Bye.
Be well and safe.
The
Namaste.
comment, Truth, that Artemis was the twin sister of Apollo, the sun god, and yet she was called the bringer of light. That's interesting.
Very interesting. Yeah.
They were
right.
twins, Artemis and Apollo.
Thanks everybody for coming. Thanks, Monica, for everything.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take
Bye-bye
care.
all.
See you next time.
Yeah.
Bye.